All right.
Right, don't.
Well, the good news is we're ready to leave the OMB universe and get a little closer to home in FTA. So let's talk about matching requirements for FTA grants. In general, it's always been the case with FTA programs. Congress has determined what the matching rates are. It may vary by program. At present, we have some comparability, and generally we can say capital is 80% federal participation, operating is 50% of the net cost of service. Some programs, such as RTAP, is 100% federal. Tribal transit, non-discretionary, is 100% federal. But like all things federal, we just like to confuse the public, and so we add some complexities to the matching equations. Before we get into the details of the complexities, let's talk about what FTA really means when they say local match. And first and foremost, never underestimate the value of cash. Cash is king. And cash can come from state and local government appropriations, dedicated tax revenues. I can probably count on both hands how many rural transit systems in the United States have a dedicated tax revenue source. There's one in Ohio, and there are 2 or 3 in Oregon, and they're the only ones I'm aware of. Does anybody in Georgia have a dedicated tax source?
We did have one in small one that several years ago when counties had a T-SLOS, transportation T-SLOS, and they added money in for operating capital for their share. So we did have one county that did that.
We also have one county currently that uses part of their TIA funds for local match.
Kathy, the 50% that y'all have a mill rate dedicated for road transit, that's a 50% number.
Yeah. Most urban areas, because FTA doesn't have enough money, certainly the formula programs don't provide enough money, and there has to be some local support to actually operate transit at a level where transit can really have an impact on the transportation picture of the urbanized area. So state assistance, by the way, has played an increasingly important role. The states now pay more for public transit than FTA does, and that's been true for almost a decade. State financial assistance now is upward in the $16 to $18 billion a year category, whereas congressional FTA apportionments are in the $12 billion a year category. So state assistance has become very critical. Again, there's no substitute for cash, so wherever you can get it, from local government or dedicated taxing sources, that is clearly the gold standard when it comes to local match. There are, however, other opportunities. Cash from other non-governmental sources other than revenues from providing public transportation. What that means is fares are not local match, in plain English. However, non-fare box revenues from the operation of public transit, such as the sale of advertising. Do many of you do that? You put a little frame on the outside of the bus, and maybe the local TV station, wants to advertise their 6 p.m. news. You get paid for doing that. And that is a source of local match. And a lot of people do that.
This is an aside from our current topic, but when they do enter into an advertising contract, has to follow the procurement for a revenue contract.
There's always a bureaucrat in the audience. Yeah, an advertising contract is what's known in procurement circles as a revenue contract. And even though you're buying a service that's producing revenue, which is the definition of a revenue contract, FTA still wants you to go through normal procurement practices to obtain the services of that firm. What typically will happen is the advertising firm will knock on your door. Some bright kid right out of college, his entry-level job is knocking on doors for an advertising firm, trying to generate advertising revenue. But you just can't accept the first offer that walks in the door. On revenue contracts, you have to treat it as if you were hiring an audit firm or a consulting firm to write your transit development plan, or the architect you would hire to design a transit facility. You've got to go through a formal competitive process to select those services. That is true of acquiring an entity to provide advertising services on your behalf. If you are in a university town, depending on the way the arrangement is structured between you and the university, if you cooperate with one another in good town and gown cooperation, you can use the monies the university might pay in lieu of counting that as fares. So for example, in the early days of transit and town and gown cooperation, we would have universities come to the table and say, we want our students to ride free. They show an ID, they ride free, and we'll pay you. And so for every time you counted a student boarding, you ding the university $1. Under that methodology, you counted the revenue as fare box revenue. Didn't count as local match. But if your negotiations with the university varies a little bit, we, the university, will contribute $1 million to the town or to the county to run the transit system in exchange for our voluntary contribution of $1 million. You let our students ride free. That $1 million becomes local match. And so that becomes, if you've got that opportunity, a very valuable source of local match. If you're Chapel Hill, North Carolina, or Lansing, Michigan, that went through that conversion years and years ago in order to take advantage of this. If we made money last year and we have a carryover surplus, we can use that money as local match. If we have an organizational rainy day fund, and we can still meet our politically determined minimum amounts to keep in our rainy day fund, and we're over that amount, we can tap into the rainy day fund to meet the local matching share. Perhaps we've established, quote unquote, a capital fund where we've tried to come up with 20% of the local share for future capital acquisitions. We'll frequently refer to that as a depreciation fund because we're only capturing the local match. But since depreciation has such a negative connotation in the grants world, I prefer to refer to it as a capital acquisition fund. And you can dip into those funds to meet the local matching share. Non-governmental sources of cash. In North Carolina, in the early 80s, the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation was instrumental in providing the local cash match for the first couple of years of operation of several of our early rural transit systems in the state. That can serve as local match. And then finally, there are some federal programs out there that with congressional blessing can be used to match other federal funds. Those are eligible. I only know of one under the federal highway programs. People smarter than I might be able to recognize a few others. They're few and far between. Most programs do not permit such use. But But those are non-traditional sources of local match. There are other ways to meet the matching requirements of an FTA grant. Number one, contributions by the non-federal entity of property. In most rural facility projects, we build the building on land contributed by the city or the county. And the land contribution essentially equals the local match of the capital facility grant. If we have services provided to the non-federal entity by other professional and technical personnel. I know of a system in Oregon where they have a board of directors who happens to be a licensed CPA. He does all their accounting work. He does that on a voluntary basis. They count the value of his service towards the local matching share. If it is a necessary and integral part of the operation of a public transit system, that can count. Early on in my career, I had noticed one of our early county rural systems in North Carolina was having difficulty meeting the local matching share. And they appeared to get creative in proposing local match. And they were offering the services, lawn maintenance services, of certain residents who were under the custodial care of the county. And aside from their striped uniforms, you wouldn't know they were work release prisoners from the county jail. And they were providing lawn maintenance services. We thought lawn maintenance was part of facility maintenance, determined it to be a necessary part. You got to cut the grass at your transit facility. And that worked rather well for Anson County, North Carolina, until NCDOT conducted the first site visit to the transit office. And I saw nothing but asphalt and pavement. There was no grass. I walked in and I said, "What's going on here? Where do these guys cut the grass?" He goes, "Up at the courthouse." "Well, that's fine, well and good. Let the courthouse use that money as match." I said, "You ain't got a prayer here. I got to disallow this from here on out." And I got called on the carpet by the county commissioners for being an ugly state employee to the county transit office. And everyone knows how that goes. If the service is integral and necessary part of the public transit operation, contributions and donations are allowable to meet the local matching share. But the critical rule to remember is that DOT funds, FTA funds, can't be used to match other DOT funds. And the burden's on your shoulders to prove what you're proposing is local match. FTA has always been fairly restrictive about this. So if you think GDOT's being tough on you, it's only because FTA is tough on them. We want to know the sources of local match at the time of application. And we want those sources to be available when necessary. So if there's a revenue that you've identified in a fiscal year that's not going to be available until May or June of the year, that's not going to be considered a very reliable source of local match from most evaluators' standpoint. It's got to be, you may need that local match right up front. And so it's got to be readily available monies. And we want to make sure you've got the local match. We don't want to put you in a situation where you draw down too much federal money and then you're placed in a position you've got to pay the overpayment back. That's not where you want to be. So that's why we want to know, we want names, we want places, we want dates, we want actual figures. We want to know where that's coming from. Now, in the world of politics, I'll use Ohio as an example again. There used to be state-funded contributions to rural transit systems. And as we proceeded into the recession of 2008, the governor, even though there was a contract of assistance between ODOT and the 5311 system, governor unilaterally canceled the contract. That money, where they had a contractual agreement, just disappeared. And that caught a lot of transit systems in Ohio flat-footed and in trouble. Probably why more Ohio people are on my wall of shame than any other state. They had to get creative, and some of them got creative beyond the bounds of legality. So that's a difficult situation. Anytime you're using a contribution, it's the methods that you use to value the contribution that are critical to its allowability. And there's some strict rules about that we'll talk about this afternoon. Let's talk about general funding ratios for those of you who are relative newbies to public transit. The state is allowed to take 10% of its 5311 apportionment off the top and use it either for state administration, it can conduct planning, or do technical studies with that money. The federal share of those expenditures is 100%. Generally, if you buy capital equipment, the federal rate of participation is 80%. There are multiple exceptions to that rule, as we'll see in a minute. Also, back in 1997, Congress got irritated with the transit industry because they felt that certain bus drivers in Seattle and Portland who were making more than $100,000 a year were being overpaid, and that transit management had let labor run roughshod over management, and it was out of control. And Congress didn't want to be a part of that story any longer. So for the largest urban areas, they eliminated operating assistance as an eligible category under 5307. For small urbanized areas, those under 200,000, you could continue to use your formula grant assistance for operations, but there was a cap. Only so much of it could be used for operations. And that put a pretty good hardship on a number of small to medium-sized transit systems. FTA was not unsympathetic, and they began looking at creative ways for you to bill what an accountant would 999 times out of 1,000 call an operating expense, but let you bill it at 80% federal participation. And so initially, we had something known as capital maintenance, and there were definitions, certain major engine overhauls and the like. FTA would let you bill that at 80% rather than 50%. And that got to be a little bit too complex. And ultimately, after the roar wound down a little bit, they just said all maintenance is eligible to be billed at the 80% capital ratio. And that's an option that the states have at their control that can help out sort of minimizing the amount of local cash necessary to operate your transit systems. Does GDOT permit capital maintenance to be cashed out at the 80% level? Most states have permitted that to happen.
What's that?
I think this is capital maintenance, did you say?
Yeah, in other words, billing. FTA now defines capital maintenance as all vehicle maintenance. And you have that option to do so in the 5307 and 5311 programs.
Is it 50%? 50%. For mine.
50%. Okay, so it's only eligible in the urbanized areas. Passenger fares must be deducted from total operating expenses in order to calculate the federal rate of participation, because the FTA only participates in the net cost of service. Operations less fares equals net cost of service. We will pay 50% of the net cost of service. There are, going back to the Section 147 demonstration days, there is a provision, if you read 9040, that permits a state at state election to classify certain operating expenses as project administration. And those expenses can be billed at the 80% level if the state elects to do that. And you do not do that in Georgia. It's about a 60-40 split in terms of how the states handle that. You guys are in the 40% category. Now, there are a bunch of exceptions. Like Oregon rates in here. You are not a sliding scale state, are you? That's where that should be. The use of formulas, particularly population-based formulas, has historically, whether it's highways or transit, has driven the western states nuts, particularly with highways, because they have a lot of area, a lot of road mileage, but not much population. And so powerful senators from the West have always lobbied for some tweaks in the formula distributions so that the western states could get more money than they would otherwise be entitled to. States like New York and Pennsylvania, Georgia would argue just the opposite. We've got the people, we need the money. And this was a battle that raged on in Congress for more than a decade before the ultimate solution was developed. There is now what's known as a sliding scale. And depending on the amount of land you have in government holdings or in national parks areas, i.e. that is undevelopable, that is not ever going to be in your tax base, there's an adjustment made to the 80-50 ratio. So for example, the state of Oregon, where I do a lot of compliance work, instead of getting 80% federal participation in capital, they get 89.73 because they have a lot of land in national parks once you get outside Portland. Their operating ratio is 56.08%. And that's because of a sliding scale. And so if you look at the tail end of Chapter 3 in 9040, there are two tables that provide the breakdowns of what the sliding scale is. Most of us on the East Coast are not subject to the sliding scale. Another thing that is available to us are certain types of projects. And again, I don't understand the logic for some of this. But if you were to go out and buy bicycle racks to add on to your fixed route fleet, so you could facilitate both two-wheel pedestrian integration with public transit usage, that part of the project could be funded at 90%. If you made improvements back in the day when we were retrofitting existing rolling stock to meet the compliance requirements of the ADA, those elements of the project could be funded at 90%. And certain Clean Air Acts, transit improvement projects that were designed to reduce ozone concentrations and CO2 particulates in the atmosphere of our urbanized areas would qualify for 90% capital project funding. And so we have these different exceptions that exist to the classic 80-50 funding ratios. Obviously, if you're a sharp grantsmanship and you want to practice skill in that area, you want to take advantage of every tweak you can get. And this is important to some states, even though we're talking about little tiny movements in the rates of federal participation in some of these